Joining me tonight is Liberal Senator for Queensland Amanda Stoker and Labor Senator for Victoria Kimberley Kitching. Welcome both of you. I want to start with you, Kimberley. I'm going to get into a bit of detail about Will Fowles a little later on the show. We saw imagery of a door kick down at a Canberra hotel tonight, but you're a Victorian and a Labor MP as well. Granted, he's in the state parliament, but news reports are that he was in Canberra last night, tripping around to everyone's maiden speeches from the Labor side. Did you see him out on the Terps? How was his behaviour?
Look, I did see him at a function that was within Parliament House last night. Sadly, I went back into the chamber, so I saw, I was there at that function briefly. He has admitted his behaviour isn't appropriate, and in fact it's appalling. But he has apologised, he's cooperated with police, he's going to take a leave of absence and seek help for addiction and mental health issues, and Daniel Andrews, the Victorian Premier, is going to support him. But I think he's quite right when he says, there are no excuses for my behaviour, because there is no excuse for behaving like that.
Should he go, Amanda Stoker?
Look, I don't know the guy at all, but that looks like pretty bad behaviour. It sounds as though he's been contrite. It sounds as though he's going to get some help. Let's hope he can pull it together.
All right, let's move on to some other issues out of Canberra. Today, Amanda, the Prime Minister made announcements that he's going to have very significant reforms headed the way of the Australian Public Service. He wants to move some departmental heads. He brought the axe down first on his own head, Martin Parkinson, who is the head of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He will now be replaced by a guy called Philip Gaetjens, who at the moment is the head of Treasury. He made it very clear, the PM, that he wants to see implementation really as the primary job of the public service, seeing that the politicians make the decisions, but of course with advice. There's implementation work that's core for the public service. Now, many argue it doesn't always get that right. Pink bats is a perfect example. How do you think this will go down with the public servants down the bottom of the hill?
Look, I expect that public servants won't like it simply because it seems like change, and change is something people are generally pretty uncomfortable with. But the reality is, for the government to fulfil the promises it has made to the Australian people, it needs to be able to act with conviction, and it needs to know that when it asks the public service to do certain things, it will do it with enthusiasm and with diligence. That's not to say anyone's not doing that at the moment, but to make changes that are designed to make sure we're getting a responsive, efficient public service that's ready for the future, that's prepared to take on the government's program with vigour and understand that it's there to take direction from the politicians, I think is a really positive thing.
I have to say, Kimberley Kitching, I was with a bit of a wry smile today listening to the criticisms from some Labor MPs about the fact that Phil Gaetjens formerly had worked for the Prime Minister as Chief of Staff in a political role and worked also for Peter Costello as Chief of Staff. Yes. Because I have to say, Frances Adamson, who now is the head of Foreign Affairs, the Department of Foreign Affairs, she was a Labor Chief of Staff. Mike Pozzulu was a Labor Chief of Staff. He's the head of the Home Affairs Department. It happens all the time, and it's happened many times on your watch.
Well, I think that there, as you know, Peter, very well, there is a lot of interactivity between, on the Hill and the public service. So I think I accept your point. I think it is, we do have to remember, though, that the public service is an independent and non-partisan public service. So having people fill those roles, no matter the side of politics they're on, of course, we have to watch that public service does remain non-partisan and independent, and the advice that it is giving is that as well. So I think that's one to watch. And of course, we have had examples where people have listened very much to public servants, and I can think of Malcolm Turnbull really wanting to believe Godwin Gretsch, for example, and that didn't end very well. So there has to be an element, I think, of also that frank and fearless advice that the public service is able to give, and that speaking truth to power. Not an expression I super love, But I think that that's a very important part of the public service as well. And we'll see both how Phil Gagens and the Prime Minister go with saying things that the Prime Minister might not want to hear, and how the Prime Minister goes with accepting that frank and fearless advice, which hopefully is going to come from the new head of the Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Let me jump in there, though. The Prime Minister doesn't have to accept frank and fearless advice. It has to listen. The Prime Minister should listen to or receive frank and fearless advice, but it's up to the Prime Minister as the decision-maker to do whatever he or she might like to with that advice. I don't think it's beyond the wit of senior public servants to be in a political office and to perform a political role, and then to go down the hill and to be, independent in the sense of the public service rules. I think we're all mature and smart enough to be able to flick those gears. We see people do it in the legal circles. Amanda, from where you once come, people could argue both sides of a case. They could argue for prosecutions as much as they could necessarily argue for defence. So I think reform is a good idea. I want to go into another issue, though. The AAT, Amanda, long held calls for reform of the AAT. Many people say, in fact, it's broken. What did you make of Ian Callinan's report this week?
Well, it's quite a substantial report, so I'm still working my way through it. But I think that the former Justice has pointed out some really good points about the ways in which we can make things more efficient on the AAT, which is something that we need in the interests both of people who are applicants, who want swift, reliable, consistent decisions, but also in the interest of the public, who want to make sure they're getting value for the money that the taxpayer has to put into this institution. It is really important that we have properly qualified people who are taking on those roles, people who are up to the job, and that they have leadership from within the organisation that helps them to get through their work in a consistent way. So I think there's lots of opportunities that come from that report, and I think the government will enjoy working through all of those to improve the institution.
What do you think, Senator Kitching?
Well, I think that, it's unwieldy and there's lots of delays in the system. I'm not sure that's down to the individual tribunal members necessarily. I think the system is geared to, to having, well, it's not, certainly lots of checks and balances in, let's take what was formerly the migration tribunal. So I think that there are, I think there's lots of parts of this to look at, and there are some people who are still going through the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, and it takes years. But that is not, I don't think, necessarily the tribunal members' fault necessarily. I think that's also within the legislation with which the tribunal member is operating in and applying.
Yeah, and I also think let's be honest,
a good point there.
There's activism too by a lot of people who act on behalf of would-be refugees, asylum seekers. They are at this stage, has not been declared refugees, who are appealing a decision that says they're not refugees and they should go home. A lot of it is activism all the way through, and even if they know they're likely to end up with an outcome in the federal court, let's say, on appeal, that they will have to return to their home country, they hope they can make an argument, having been here for X number of years and had X number of children, that they should be allowed to stay. And often we see the result where, the rules are bent and they're allowed to remain. So I think people in the community, at least, if not Canberra, want to see this reviewed. Senator Kitching, why on earth has the Medevac legislation that the government's tried to repeal, it's been in place only for a short time, the government opposed it at the beginning but never had the numbers. Kerryn Phelps and others, including Labor, got it up. After the election, the government wants it removed, repealed. But your Senate colleagues and yourself are sent it off to an inquiry until November. Why the inquiry?
Well, I think it's due to report back to the Senate on October the 18th. You're right, it probably won't get into the chamber before early November. I think, to look at, I think it would be good to have the Senate committee look at this issue without the hysteria we've seen. Remember, Peter, in the past, 90 people have been brought to Australia under this legislation. It only applies to those people who are already in the system, so it wouldn't have applied to the Sri Lankan boat that came quite recently. And in the last calendar year, of course, and I was thinking of the one last week, but I think, though, that 900 people have come in the last calendar year, brought here by the government for medical purposes. So I think if the Senate inquiry is able to be done without the hysteria that has been accompanying this, the review of this legislation, or this legislation going through the House, I think that that will be a good thing.
Senator Kitching, please. I worked in the Senate for 10 years. You're talking to me here. That is the biggest load of politics I have ever heard. This is a Labor is politicising this whole issue. The government has a mandate. Everyone likes to crow about a mandate. There couldn't have been a clearer mandate on Medevac if the government was returned. It was returned. And why doesn't Labor accept that the government has the right to remove a piece of legislation it violently opposed before the election?
Remember, Peter, we are not here to rubber stamp legislation through. We are here to be an alternative, not an echo of the government. So we are not here, and certainly the Senate, by its very nature, must review legislation. That is what it does.
Well, it's supposed to be a State's House of review if we want to go all the way back.
An inquiry.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a State's House
There is nothing wrong with having an inquiry into this legislation.
Amanda Stoker, should it be just dealt with? Should it have been dealt with this week?
It should absolutely have been dealt with this week. And to suggest that a committee process is going to reduce the hysteria is, I'm going to go with misguided, because I know that my friend Senator Kitching is a very good person. But seriously, it is only going to invite more hysteria, particularly from these extreme Greens who want to pretend that the government is out here to deny medical care to people who are being offshore processed, when in reality we all know that there is a ratio of 1 medical practitioner for every 7 people in offshore processing, 1 to 14 ratio on mental health care, and that literally almost 1,000 people have been provided specialist care being evacuated without these laws. There was no crisis in medical care in offshore processing. It has been manufactured to undermine the offshore processing system because people on the left don't believe in it. And this is their vehicle to continue to grandstand on it, nothing less than that.
Can I put 2 images up on the screen? One is a billboard that has been banned here in New South Wales, and I'll put it up on the screen so people can see it at home. It's from Emily's Voice. It's a heart billboard. You can see it up on the screen. It's in relation to a campaign called notbornyet.com, saying that a heart beats at 4 weeks. For some reason, we'll talk about that as to why it's now been banned, and O Media, which is an outdoor media site company, refuses to now carry this ad. But the other one I want to put up on the screen is imagery of a pod, a suicide pod, that Dr Philip Nitschke, that many know, the Australian doctor who has been long advocating euthanasia. He has built this pod. People can go in there and basically die. People can even 3D print it themselves. You can have it in your home. It uses nitrogen and other things as opposed to intravenous drugs to kill you at will, and he claims it's not illegal. Now, how is one Amanda Stoker banned and one being now, what it looks to me, freely available?
Well, what he has tried to do is put together a series of legal items in a combination that will affect death. And look, he's right to say that there's no criminalisation of suicide anymore, but that's almost the very point. We can't stop people who want to end their lives from ending their lives if that's what they really want to do. But that's a world of difference from state-sanctioned death in circumstances where you bring in a euthanasia regime. When you do that, when you give the imprimatur of the state to the ending of life, when you start to ask doctors who are trained to heal to kill, then you change culture in a way that, subtly changes the playing field so that those who are old and becoming resource intensive, or those with a disability, feel like it's their job to go rather than be a burden. And that's something that's an enormous problem. So, this fella's in town, he's in the Gold Coast because, I presume, the Queensland Parliament is considering this very issue, legalising euthanasia, and he's there, almost making it sound glamorised. He's calling it peaceful, elegant and euphoric. Let's call this what it is. It is suicide, and it is something that has had a huge cultural impact if we allow it to become the norm.
And what about the other billboard?
The billboard, gosh. If the idea that a child in utero at 4 weeks has a heartbeat is so offensive these days that it's got to be brought down, golly, we have trouble with basic biological facts these days. In circumstances where often very suggestive, almost explicit stuff is fine in a billboard, when things that are not necessarily healthy for your body are fine on a billboard, and I don't have a problem with that. This could be the subject of censorship. It's an extraordinary thing, and I think it says an awful lot about the way that there is a cultural pressure to silence conservative voices out of the media.
Senator Kitching?
Look, we had in the Senate last year the Territories Assisted Dying legislation. I didn't vote for it. I think the Victorian government obviously has a euthanasia legislation, and it's a I think people spent some time and thinking to get that legislation through. I wouldn't have voted for that either. So the thought that Dr. Nitschke is, as Amanda says, encouraging, it's almost the way that it's framed is, a euphoric death. I mean, this is really not something I think we want to encourage. I think it needs to be in a framework. And of course, the 3D printing makes it very readily available.
Yes.
So it comes with no framework. And I think the regulatory scheme around 3D printing is a much larger problem because, of course, one is able to print, for example, weapons and then modify them, to modify them as they're printed. So this is, I think, an area that probably needs some looking at. But I don't agree with Dr. Nitschke.
And the billboard, the other billboard?
The other billboard, look, I don't agree with that either. I think that if people want to run that, I don't think it's offensive. It's a blessing. There's a sanctity to life, I think.